Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 539, Japan Falling. In 1987, a British historian by the name of Paul Kennedy published the first edition of a book called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. It's about, well, more or less what it says on the tin. Kennedy's work is a survey of great power politics from about 1500 or so to the end of the 20th century, and his argument, in as much as one can summarize a 300-ish page book in a few sentences, is that A. Economic power and resources are what make a great power great. B. Power is always relative, because nation-states are in a constant state of military competition. And thus C. Military overstretch and economic stagnation are the main threats to a great power's standing. Much of the actual work is spent applying that basic framework to the last half a millennium of great power politics to show how it fits. Now, the rise and fall of great powers has been controversial since it came out, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just that the thesis triggered a lot of healthy academic debate. Depending on who you ask, it's either a gross oversimplification that ignores pretty much all non-material aspects of politics, or the political equivalent of a work of prophecy which predicted the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Or, many other things, it's a very talked about book. But there's one other thing that people familiar with modern Japanese history tend to know about the first edition of Kennedy's magnum opus. The first edition, and only the first edition, came with a rather interesting frontispiece, which, as we all know from our deep knowledge of high-end book terminology, is an illustration facing the cover page. That illustration showed a 3-step podium like the type you'd see at the Olympics. Stepping off the podium to the right, presumably into some kind of obscurity, was John Bull himself, symbol and incarnation of the British Empire. Atop the podium was, of course, Uncle Sam, the image of American power, whose ascendancy represented the Pax Americana in all its glory. But in the image, Uncle Sam is stepping off the podium, and replacing him atop it is a corporate salaryman carrying the Hinomaru flag, symbolizing Japan. And that image is pretty accurate to where the conversation around Japan's economic ascendancy was in 1987. In just under 3 decades since the rise of Ikeda Hayato after the Security Treaty protests, his political template had remade the country from the ground up. Japan's economy had undergone one of the greatest booms in human history. The nation's GDP per capita had increased by 241% from 1960 to 1980, and Japan itself had shot up the rankings to become the world's second largest economy after only the United States itself. Though Ikeda Hayato was long dead and his faction of the LDP was no longer the dominant one, the political structure he created was so obviously effective, it had been embraced by the rest of the party and continued to dominate the political conversation. The so-called Iron Triangle of Japan, composed of the LDP, which drafted growth-oriented policies, the major corporations which implemented and benefited from them, and an economic bureaucracy which mediated the whole thing, was so effective at engineering rapid economic growth that the whole apparatus was often referred to by both its proponents and detractors as Japan Incorporated, the nation as megacorporation. There was even talk around the world that by the 21st century, Japan would surpass the United States economically, hence the implication of that illustration in the rise and fall of great powers. Which, by the way, did good numbers in Japan itself, where the message of the book that economics equals power found a very receptive audience. Interest in the book was such that it was translated into Japanese and published within 28 days of its original English language printing, and supposedly all 600,000 copies sold out more or less immediately. But here's the thing, the golden age of Japan Incorporated did not last, and starting in the 1990s, and at long last we're getting into history I dimly remember from my childhood, Japan entered a multi-decade recession that it's still feeling the effects of. Newer editions from the rise and fall of great powers no longer carry that old frontispiece. I actually found a more recent interview with Paul Kennedy from the New Statesman talking about the influence of his work, and the illustration for that replicates the imagery of the old illustration but with a uniformed soldier representing Russia, and a new besuited businessman, this time representing the People's Republic of China. So this week, how did it all go so wrong so fast? And we have to start off here by talking a bit more about the conversation around Japan's economic rise. You see, it's definitely the case that part of what made the dramatic rise of Japan Incorporated possible was a very favorable environment created by the United States, which after all handled most of the defense expenditures for Japan by virtue of its military presence as well as the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty itself. Japan did contribute as well with the Jieitai, or self-defense forces, the restricted military government lawyers determined the Constitution allowed, and eventually by covering some of the expenses associated with America's military presence in Japan, but most of that economic burden was borne by the United States. The US also enabled some very cheap and highly favorable technology transfers to Japan and set up free trade agreements that made it very easy for Japanese companies to sell goods in the United States. Those agreements were maintained even when it became clear that Japan's own government was not going to reciprocate. It constantly threw up barriers to foreign companies operating in Japan to protect domestic industries from competition, not exactly in keeping with the spirit of free trade. But throughout the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, the feeling in Washington, D.C. was, let them. Who cares? We are the United States of America, the world's greatest superpower. We can afford to be generous if it keeps Japan on the American side of the Cold War and enables the country's economic growth, which was, of course, critical to fending off the Red Menace within Japan. Japanese companies took advantage of this generosity to the hilt, and by the late 70s, the conversation in the United States was starting to shift. In several industries, most notably TV and automobiles, Japanese companies were able to very effectively undercut their American counterparts. In part, this was an issue of quality. Many American companies coasted on their brand reputation, where their Japanese counterparts were committed to making offerings that competed on price and quality. In part, this was an issue of some, let's call it, dubiously legitimate maneuvering. The protection from foreign competition that most Japanese firms got meant they could jack up prices in Japan itself and then use that financial cushion, buoyed by cheap loans arranged by the bureaucracy, to sell at a loss overseas. That's called dumping, and it's technically illegal under the rules of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade / World Trade Organization, as well as breaking the free trade agreements signed by the US and Japan. But proving price collusion is really hard, especially when it comes to foreign companies, and attempts to do that got tied up in court for decades and largely proved inconclusive. As a result, by the 1980s, the once proud US TV industry, for example, had been decimated. There's a reason most of you listening don't remember Westinghouse TVs or General Electric ones or what have you, because by the 1980s, only one US domestic TV producer, Zenith, was still around, and by the way, they later got bought out by the Korean firm LG, though the brand itself remains. Similarly, the travails of the American auto industry and the resulting devastation of cities like Detroit are well known. This produced, rather unsurprisingly, a lot of resentment in the United States, but it is important to note that while Japan's government and corporations skirted some trade rules to do what they did, a lot of what drove the public discussion around this in Japan also had an element of race politics to it. For example, the nuances of American trade policy as they related to the Cold War and how those interacted with Japan's domestic political economy were really the drivers of the growing trade deficit between the two nations, but if you tuned into the evening news in the 1980s, you probably weren't going to hear all that boring macroeconomics stuff. Instead, you were going to be treated to a piece about Japanese conglomerates purchasing classic pieces of Americana. Thus, Sony's purchase of Columbia Pictures in the 1980s produced the somewhat problematic Newsweek headline, "Japan Invades Hollywood," while Mitsui's purchase of a chunk of the MetLife building atop Grand Central Station in New York produced a great deal of outrage that this classic piece of New York architecture was no longer in American hands. Perhaps the most over-the-top reaction came in 1989 when a real estate company associated with Mitsubishi purchased a 51% stake in Radio City Music Hall in New York. A member of Congress, Helen Bentley, a Republican from Maryland, went on the floor of the House to express her concern that the Rockettes would become geishas as a result. Meanwhile, the cultural conversation around the US-Japan relationship, well, I think it's best summarized by the fact that two of 1992's most popular books were Michael Crichton's novel Rising Sun, a murder mystery that was really a didactic piece about the dangers of free trade with Japan, and the book The Coming War with Japan, which I think you can pretty much guess what that's about from the title. Probably the most horrific example of the tenor of this period was the brutal murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. Chin was a Chinese-American man murdered by a pair of laid-off Chrysler employees who attacked and killed him because they thought he was Japanese. And by the way, both men were acquitted of murder at the state level. Only a national outcry led to a federal charge that was ultimately successful, that they had violated Chin's civil rights. It's also worth noting that during this period, the US-Japan trade deficit was one of the largest ones America had, but it was far from the only massive trade deficit. In 1984, that deficit stood at 36.8 billion USD worth of goods. In other words, Japan was selling 36.8 billion US dollars worth of stuff more to the US than the US was selling to Japan. But the US-Canada trade relationship was similarly unbalanced to the tune of $20.4 billion, while Taiwan and the German Federal Republic were similarly positioned to the tune of roughly $10 billion each. Yet those trade balances were never a part of the public discourse in quite the same way. And to be clear, I'm not arguing here there was no legitimate reason to be upset about that trade balance in the 1980s, or that the negative reaction was entirely a product of racism, but there was an element of the reaction that mimicked older American racial rhetoric about the dangers of the yellow peril. It was to address this trade balance and to shore up the US-Japan relationship, and also America's economy more generally, that in 1985 the United States government sponsored a meeting with international leaders at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The goal of these talks, sponsored by the government of President Ronald Reagan and taking place with the governments of Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, was to change the balance of trade among these countries to be more favorable to the United States in recognition of America's role as one of the major guarantors of security for all of these countries. Specifically, the goal of the resulting Plaza Accord was to depreciate the value of the US dollar in order to improve the competitiveness of American goods. And here we're going to have to take a step out of history and into the land of macroeconomics. For those of you who are not filled with joy at this thought, don't worry, I'll do my best to make this straightforward. To keep things simple, we're going to focus on the relationship between the yen and the American dollar. One of the concessions offered to Japan early in the post-war era had been an agreement to fix the exchange rate between the two countries at 360 yen to $1. No matter how much the economies of these two countries grew, and Japan's economy had grown quite a bit, 360 yen would always be equal to $1, and vice versa. And this was a huge advantage for Japanese companies dealing in the US. Normally, as Japan's economy grew, the value of the yen would increase and the exchange rate would rebalance to be more even, say to 200 yen to $1. Instead, even as America began to run a huge deficit with Japan, American goods would never get cheaper in Japan and Japanese goods would never get more expensive in America, thanks to the fixed exchange rate. The Plaza Accords, which went into effect on September 22, 1985, switched the exchange rate to a floating one. In practice, this guaranteed the value of the yen would go up and the exchange rate would become more balanced in America's favor. That's exactly what happened. By the end of that year, the rate plummeted to somewhere around 219 yen to $1. So what does that mean in practice? Why does it matter? Well, let's take an example. Imagine that you have two TV companies, a Japanese one that makes TV sets with a manufacturing cost of 10,000 yen, and an American one that does the same for a cost of $100. Are those numbers realistic? I have no idea. I've never made a TV. Don't worry about it, doesn't really matter. Under the old system, and ignoring anything like marketing or shipping costs because I don't want to do that much math, the Japanese company would, if it wanted to sell its TVs in America, have a price floor of $27.78 to make back its manufacturing costs. The American company, meanwhile, would have a price floor of 36,000 yen. Under an exchange rate of 219 yen to the dollar, though, those numbers would change a lot. Now the price floor for the Japanese TV is $45.67, while the price floor for the Americans is 21,900 yen. Thus, consumers in Japan who previously might have avoided the American TV would see its price go down by over a third and might be way more likely to consider it. Meanwhile, American consumers looking to buy a TV would see the Japanese offering become a lot pricier and would be more likely to consider another, potentially American-made option. And you might be thinking, this seems like a pretty raw deal on the Japanese side. Why would Japan sign it? Now, the answer is complicated. For one thing, the sense in the Japanese government was that some form of agreement was necessary to keep the alliance with the US functional. As much as Japan was dominating international trade in the 1980s, it was still dependent on America for its national security. The Japanese self-defense forces were and still are fairly small, and the largest military presence in East Asia by far was the United States. For another, many Japanese economic leaders believed that allowing the yen to strengthen in relation to the dollar was good for Japan's international prestige. Powerful countries usually have powerful currencies, so allowing Japan's currency to increase in its value compared to the dollar was a sign of Japan's growing prestige. A rising yen would also boost the nominal value of Japan's gross domestic product, the overall value of the economy every year, in comparison to the United States. In other words, the same amount of GDP for Japan in yen was worth more in dollars if the yen-to-dollar exchange rate went down. If, as some analysts were predicting, Japan was going to surpass the US as the world's #1 economy by value, a lower exchange rate would help make that happen. Still, this was a risky maneuver. Japan's economy in 1985 was very dependent on exports, particularly to the United States. That was true both in terms of sales, of course, but also growth. You see, all the advantages that Japanese companies previously held in terms of trade with the US meant there had always been an obvious thing for them to do with the profits they made: pump those profits into more production. Let's go back to our TV example. You're a Japanese executive at a TV manufacturing firm, and under the old 360 yen to $1 scheme, you're making a killing. Given the advantages you have in the US market because of that exchange rate, it only makes sense for you to take the profits of your business and put them right back into making even more TVs to sell in the United States, which will net you more money that you can then plow back into expanding capacity. This whole approach not only ensured profits, but something more important: constant economic growth. To fuel this constantly growing production, you would always need more factory workers, more construction workers to build the factories, more office managers to manage the factories, and all of them would be making more money and making more stuff and growing the economy. And ever since Ikeda Hayato, economic growth had been the mantra of the LDP, the premise on which the party's dominance was built. Now growth was looking harder. In fact, the news of the Plaza Accord triggered a mini recession in Japan as the cash flows coming from overseas sales, which Japanese companies had relied on for years, began to dry up. So now the Japanese government, still led of course by the LDP and its prime minister at the time, Nakasone Yasuhiro, had a problem. Businesses, shockingly enough, do need money to do things like make stuff and pay people, which it turns out are pretty important to a functional economy. The old sources of cash to do that were drying up. So where do we get a new one? The answer that Nakasone and the economic bureaucrats advising him came up with was twofold. The government would free up money for businesses first through loans, which do have one problem in that the companies would need to pay interests on those loans after taking them out, and thus pay back more cash than they got in the long term. But that issue could be mitigated to an extent. The Bank of Japan, responsible for managing monetary policy just like the Federal Reserve in the US, could be convinced to keep interest rates on loans very low, making them cheap to pay back. The second way to get more money was to print more yen, which had the handy side benefit of driving down the value of the yen because more supply of anything lowers its value, and thus keeping the yen to dollar exchange rate from going up too much. We're not going to get too deep into the paint here, but if you're confused, think of it this way. The government tried to prevent a recession after the Plaza Accord by finding ways to provide domestically the money that was no longer coming from overseas. All of this money produced by loans and by printing more yen could then be used to drive Japan's economic growth, this time in a direction that was more focused on the internal Japanese market than on overseas exports. Prime Minister Nakasone was very vocal in publicizing his support for this new economic policy fueled by growing Japan's internal economy with printed cash and borrowed money. He justified his new policy with a wonderfully pithy line: "Japan is like a mahjong player that always wins. Sooner or later, the other players will decide they do not want to play with him." In other words, Japan had to restrict its exports itself and refocus its economy, otherwise the nations of the world would end up restricting Japan's exports for it by simply not allowing Japanese goods into their country. Nakasone reinforced this talking point by going on a very public shopping spree early in 1986, buying a series of imported goods: an American tennis racket, a French shirt, an Italian tie, all intended to show the country was no longer just selling stuff overseas, but developing its own domestic consumer economy to import them too, evening out the playing field, so to speak. And Nakasone's whole gamble worked, at least for a time, because we now come to the origins of what is known as the bubble economy, driven by a new question facing Japanese businesses. That question was, okay, thanks to Nakasone and his policies, we have a new supply of money, and we have to invest it to grow the domestic Japanese economy, not just in a direction focused on exports, but what does that actually mean? What do we do with the money? The old obvious answer, just invest in more manufacturing capacity, doesn't really work. So what's the new one? Well, companies quickly did settle on a new one, a really good option, or at least so it seemed: real estate. Land, of course, is very valuable. Pretty much everybody needs it in some respect, and it is a finite resource. It's not like it's possible to make more, or at least not without a substantial expense attached. So if you really need a place to invest profits from your business, you could do worse than buying up some land and either waiting for it to increase in value and selling it, or just renting it, or both. What could possibly go wrong? And so what happened was simply that most Japanese firms began to invest very heavily in real estate for all these reasons, causing the value of Japan's real estate market to go up. That's Economics 101 after all. If everyone is suddenly interested in buying something, in other words, if demand goes up, and supply is fixed, you can't get more land, then price goes up. And if price goes up, that just proves real estate is a good investment and convinces even more people to hop on the bandwagon, which increases demand, which will increase price, which will cause more people to be convinced that real estate is a good investment, which will increase demand, which you get the idea. During the 1980s, Japanese businesses went from taking the profits from their exports and investing them in more exports to taking cheap money from bank loans and investing that money in real estate. On paper, this looks like a fantastic idea. The government's decision to keep interest rates low meant it was very easy to take out large loans at minimal cost, and then make a killing investing those loans in a real estate market that only seemed to go up in value. You could then take the value you earned from your investments, pay back the loans easily, and pocket the profits. And for a time, it was a great deal. Many firms made a killing off of this investment. The new policy also succeeded at doing exactly what it had been supposed to do, driving economic growth. In 1985, the year the Plaza Accords were signed, Japan's economy grew by 5.2%. The next year, the shock of the Accords was still being felt, and while growth took place, it was only by 3.3%, a bit of a drop-off. But then the recovery began. In 1987, the economy grew by 4.7%, and by 1988, an astonishing 6.7%. For comparison, the US figures for growth during this period were 4.2, 3.5, 3.3, and 4.2% respectively. The new order of the Plaza Accord, intended to put a brake on Japan's high-speed growth, had in fact done nothing of the sort. It did succeed, however, in driving property values through the absolute roof. To be fair, that was not true everywhere in Japan. Major cities were naturally enough where the largest corporations were located and therefore the worst hit. Commercial real estate was also way more desirable than residential real estate. Companies couldn't do much with land they were only allowed to build homes on, except maybe set up corporate dormitories. Commercial real estate could let you build showrooms, offices, expand into new industries, far more options. So the price of commercial land especially skyrocketed. Prices went up everywhere. On average, from 1985 to 1991, commercial land went up 81% in value, while the value of land zoned for residential or industrial use went up 52%. But that only tells part of the story because, again, expansion was not spread around evenly. 6 cities in particular were hit by extreme price increases. Tokyo, naturally enough, then Yokohama, Nagoya, Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe. These were, and still are, some of the largest cities in Japan. They take up 6 of the top 7 spots for Japanese cities ranked by size of population. The 7th, if you're wondering, is the northern city of Sapporo, which was spared a massively expanding real estate market because who wants to work in godforsaken Hokkaido? In these 6 cities, commercial real estate increased by a staggering 302% in value over the same 6-year period. Basically, any company that was pumping money into the real estate market in those cities saw huge profits. Profits that could then be turned around and invested elsewhere, like, say, crazy purchases overseas. Tokyo in particular went a bit nuts. At one point, a square meter of commercial real estate in the prestigious Ginza neighborhood, this is around 11 square feet, was going for around $750,000. And as the icing on top, remember, this was all supposed to address the trade deficit between the US and Japan. But the year after the Plaza Accords went into effect, the imbalance actually went up, from being $46 billion in Japan's favor to over $55 billion. By the early 90s, things did even out a bit at the low 40s, but then the balance would tip back to being over $50 billion in Japan's favor. The concrete facts still pointed to Japanese economic dominance, and even the optics of the US-Japan relationship carefully stage managed as they were, suggested the same. The enduring symbol of the US-Japan relationship at this point in history is, of course, the iconic moment when, in December 1991, then-President George H.W. Bush went on a visit to Japan as part of a worldwide trade trip. He hoped to shore up the US-Japan friendship during a rocky time, while just generally promoting American goods overseas. The itinerary was a bit of a whirlwind, though. Japan was towards the tail end of a 12-day trip across 16 time zones, which might have contributed to what came next. When President Bush got to Japan, he had a nice photo op with then-Emperor Akihito and Crown Prince Naruhito, who is of course now Emperor Naruhito. Bush was an avid tennis player, as were both the Emperor and Crown Prince. Emperor Akihito actually met his wife playing tennis. And so President Bush played a doubles match against the imperial family, with a former ambassador to Japan as his partner, and of course, given how tired he was from the trip, he got absolutely creamed. To be fair, my understanding is that both Akihito and Naruhito were also playing very well. They are both, by all accounts, very serious tennis people, but I'm not really a tennis person. So, again, optics-wise, not gonna play great on the evening news. I mean, American and Japanese representatives line up for a friendly competition, and the Americans get destroyed? You don't need a PhD in English to put that metaphor together. But the worst was yet to come. President Bush wasn't just tired, he was ill with what was probably the flu. Still, his dedication to duty led to the president soldiering on. He did have to excuse himself from a state dinner late in the day with Prime Minister Miyazawa Kiichi to go to the bathroom and throw up, but refused to cancel the rest of the dinner afterwards. He was, after all, the president, the chief representative of the United States. He had a diplomatic job to do, regardless of whether or not he was feeling good. Which is very inspiring and patriotic, but honestly, he really should have called it a night. Because shortly after returning, between the second course, salmon, sashimi, and caviar, and the third, grilled beef and pepper sauce, the President of the United States fainted, slumped to his left, and then vomited all over Prime Minister Miyazawa's lap. And that, my friends, that is a goddamn metaphor. To be fair, none of this was really President Bush's fault. The worst you can say is that he should have known to call things off earlier. And Prime Minister Miyazawa was very diplomatic and nice about the whole thing, but it's a state dinner. The whole thing was being recorded and was on the evening news. You can still find videos of this on YouTube. And again, while I really do think in reality this was just a bit of bad luck for the American president, the symbolism of the moment was hard to overlook. Since 1945, the US-Japan relationship had been an unequal one, even if presidents since 1960 had taken some care with the optics not to drive that home too much. Now the dynamic looked very different. Quite a few of my future teachers in graduate school were coming up the academic ranks, so to speak, at this point, and I remember one of them who worked on economic policy telling me that when she visited Japan to do research during this period, the bureaucrats she was interviewing would routinely offer her incredibly expensive meals or bottles of champagne or liquor, sometimes worth hundreds or even thousands of dollars. The glitz of this period, the amount of money flying through the economy, is hard to overstate. But of course, it didn't last. In the end, two distinct shifts brought down the bubble economy. We'll cover the second of these, the absolute raft of scandals that rocked Japanese politics during this period, next week. But now that I've amused you by talking about puke for a bit, I want to go back to boring you with one last bit of talk about economic policy in the form of the Bank of Japan. Remember, the Bank of Japan is basically equivalent to the Federal Reserve in the US, responsible for setting fiscal policy, and most importantly, the prime interest rate that determines the price of loans. Theoretically, like the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan is supposed to be independent, because otherwise there would be so much pressure to set economically bad, but politically popular, financial policies. In practice, however, the Bank of Japan's power over the Japanese economy and controlling the cost of loans is a lot of power, was coveted by a lot of different groups. Specifically, there was a lot of rivalry between what you might call the BOJ lifers, people who came up within the Bank of Japan, and members of the rest of the economic bureaucracy like the Ministry of Finance, for whom the Bank of Japan was very central to some of the things they wanted to see happen in Japan's economy. Now, early on in the post-war period, this resulted in a very tense relationship until an agreement between the two groups split control of the governorship of the Bank of Japan between them. From December of 1964 onward, the position of the governor of the Bank of Japan alternated on 5-year terms between a senior Bank of Japan lifer and a candidate from the Ministry of Finance. The deputy governor of the bank, the second in command essentially, would go to the other side, so to speak, and the chosen candidate for deputy would pretty much always become the next senior governor. So why does that matter? Well, because as Japan's real estate bubble was coming together, the Bank of Japan governor, Sumita Satoshi, was dealing with some pretty serious issues within the bank. He was a finance ministry guy and was very worried about how things were looking economically. Why would he be if everything was going so well and everyone was rich? Well, he was worried it wasn't sustainable. Specifically, Sumita was worried that the cheap loans created by the bank were resulting in bad investments that were going to lose money. In essence, people were taking the borrowed money and making gambles, particularly on real estate that was likely, at this point, hugely overvalued. No one could actually buy it for that amount without the super cheap loans the Bank of Japan was offering. They were not carefully planning their investments. But hey, they didn't have to plan. Loans were cheap. Real estate prices were growing fast. It didn't matter. Except, of course, that even with the cheap credit, eventually there would be a cap on how much real estate could grow in value, and when that cap was hit, things could go very bad very quickly. But Sumita couldn't do much about this. He was a finance ministry outsider, and both his deputy governor, Miyano Yasushi, and the head of the Bank of Japan's central banking division, Fukui Toshiko, did their best to sideline him because of that. Neither of these Bank of Japan lifers shared their boss's concerns. They were advocates of cheap credit as a way of growing the economy and had substantial power to implement their vision. Fukui, in particular, engaged in a very boring policy called window guidance, basically using his influence over other Japanese banks to arrange cheaper credit for favored businesses, totally independent of the control of the bank governor. Fukui's central banking division had so much independence in that regard, it was sometimes jokingly called the Kwantung Army, because just like the Kwantung Army of the 1930s in Manchuria, he did whatever the hell he wanted to, regardless of what anyone in Tokyo thought about it. Sumita did eventually override his underlings' objections and slightly raise the interest rate in May of 1989 from 2 to 2.5%, but in December of 1989 his term was up. He left office and Miyano, the Bank of Japan lifer, stepped in. Now, Miyano Yasushi disliked Sumita and other finance ministry outsiders and had fought his influence for that reason, but Miyano was also an economist, and once he took over it became very clear to him that the economy was in fact a bit wonky. People were investing poorly. Real estate was overvalued. Really, something had to be done about it, because sooner or later people would realize this and then things would get bad. Ideally, what needed to happen here was a gradual cooling off, slowly creating incentives over the course of years for people to slowly shift their money away from overheated markets like real estate, so that investors and businesses would have time to adjust their plans and rework their financial holdings. If, God forbid, things went too rapidly, then all the money tied up in bad real estate loans would vanish as the value of said real estate crashed, and that would probably tank the economy. The way to do this really was to raise the interest rates on loans like Sumita had done in May. But this had to be done very slowly, gradually, slowly raising the interest rate to slowly make all of these loans look like worse and worse deals, so that over time, valuations would gradually adjust. But that's not what happened. Unlike Sumita, and for whatever reason, it's honestly still not clear, Miyano acted very quickly. raising the interest rate from 2.5 to 6% within just a few years. And that was catastrophic in hindsight. Remember, the bubble system was built on cheap money that allowed people to buy a lot of assets, including real estate, pushing the value of those assets up. Suddenly, no one could afford to do that anymore. The loans you'd need to afford that $750,000 square meter of space in Tokyo were suddenly too expensive. And that meant all of a sudden, real estate wasn't a good business anymore. So, people started selling their real estate holdings. And if everybody is selling something at the same time, if supply increases rapidly all at once, price goes down. Those falling prices will convince more people to sell, which lowers the price, which convinces more people to sell, which, once again, you get the idea. And this was really, really bad, because remember, the reason real estate was so hot was that major companies were investing in it with their profits, to the tune in some cases of 40 to 50% of their assets. The money held by those companies, necessary to do things like employ people and keep their lights on, was now vanishing in one go as the valuation of their real estate crashed. I cannot stress enough how bad this is. If you remember the 2008 housing crisis in the US, so much of how America responded to that was crafted by economists whose major concern was, don't do what Japan did in the 90s. So this is a huge crisis. But fortunately, the political system built by the LDP and Ikeda Hayato can totally handle it, right? Next week, we will see the system not handle it as we more or less wrap up this series and arrive where we're at today. But that's for next week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackwards. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the final episode of the revised introduction to Japanese history.